I never expected to find Margaret, my mother-in-law, in my bedroom at 2 a.m. The soft creak of the floorboards had woken me from a restless sleep, and there she was, illuminated by the pale moonlight streaming through the curtains, her frail hands rifling through my dresser drawers with surprising urgency. "Margaret," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the darkness. "What are you doing?" She froze like a deer caught in headlights, her silver hair disheveled, her usually pristine nightgown wrinkled. For a moment we stared at each other across the room, me sitting up in bed, heart pounding, and her standing there with guilt written across her weathered face. "Sarah dear," she stammered, her voice trembling. I was just looking for some aspirin. I thought you might have some in here." The excuse was flimsy at best. The medicine cabinet in the hallway bathroom was well stocked and Margaret knew it. Besides, she was searching through my underwear drawer. Hardly the place one would expect to find pain medication. "The aspirin is in the bathroom cabinet, Margaret. You know that." I kept my tone gentle but firm. Despite our complicated relationship, I respected her as my husband David's mother. Her hands shook as she closed the drawer, the wooden slide making a soft thud in the quiet room. Of course, how silly of me. I must be more confused than I thought. But Margaret wasn't confused. In the 3 years since David and I had been married, I'd learned that my mother-in-law was sharp as a tack, despite her 78 years. She remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every detail of family history going back decades. The woman who could recite her grocery list from memory wasn't confused about where we kept the aspirin. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. "Should I wake David?" "No." The word came out sharper than intended, and she immediately softened her tone. "No, dear. Don't wake him. He works so hard and he needs his rest." There was something in her eyes, a desperation I'd never seen before. Margaret had always been composed, almost regal in her bearing. She was the type of woman who never had a hair out of place, who served tea in china cups and insisted on proper table manners. Seeing her disheveled and panicked was unsettling. "I'll just go back to my room now," she said, moving toward the door with careful steps. "I'm sorry I disturbed you, Sarah." As she reached for the doorknob, something glinted in the moonlight, something small and metallic that she quickly shoved into her nightgown pocket. My breath caught in my throat. She had taken something from my drawer after all. "Margaret, wait." But she was already gone, the door closing behind her with a soft click. I sat there in the darkness, my mind racing. What could she have possibly wanted from my dresser? And what had she taken? I slipped out of bed and padded across the cold hardwood floor to my dresser. With trembling fingers, I opened the drawer she'd been searching through. Everything looked normal at first glance. Folded underwear, bras, a few pairs of stockings. But as I moved things around, I realized something was indeed missing. My old locket. The small silver heart that had belonged to my grandmother was gone. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of Margaret's desperate face from my mind. Over breakfast, I watched her carefully as she served David his coffee with her usual precision. She appeared completely normal, hair perfectly styled, makeup applied with a steady hand, wearing one of her signature cardigans. If I hadn't witnessed last night's events myself, I would have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. "You're quiet this morning," David observed, looking up from his newspaper. My husband was a creature of habit. The same breakfast routine, the same sections of the paper read in the same order every day. "Everything okay?" I glanced at Margaret, who was buttering her toast with deliberate care, not meeting my eyes. "Just didn't sleep well," I said finally. "Maybe you should try that chamomile tea Mother recommended," he suggested, reaching across to squeeze my hand. "She swears by it for insomnia." Margaret's knife paused mid-spread, and for just a moment her composed mask slipped. I saw that same desperation from the night before flicker across her features before she regained control. "Yes," she said softly, "chamomile is very soothing." After David left for work, the house fell into an uncomfortable silence. Margaret and I had never been close, not enemies but not friends either. She'd made it clear from the beginning that she thought David could have done better, though she'd grown more accepting over the years. Still, we'd developed a polite coexistence, sharing pleasantries about the weather and neighborhood gossip. Today felt different. The air between us crackled with unspoken tension. "Margaret," I began, finding her in the kitchen washing dishes. "About last night." I told you, dear, I was confused. Her voice was steady, but her hands scrubbed the already clean plate with unnecessary force. You took my grandmother's locket. The plate slipped from her soapy fingers and clattered into the sink. For a long moment the only sound was the drip of the kitchen faucet, drip, 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 marking the seconds of silence between us. I don't know what you're talking about, she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. Margaret, please. I'm not angry, I just want to understand. That locket means everything to me. It's all I have left of my grandmother. If you needed it for some reason, you could have just asked. She turned to face me then, and I was startled by the tears in her eyes. This proud woman who never showed weakness was crying over a simple piece of jewelry. You don't understand, she whispered. You can't understand. Then help me understand. Talk to me. For a moment I thought she might confide in me. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but then she shook her head violently. Some things are better left buried, Sarah. Some secrets should stay in the past. What secrets? Margaret, you're scaring me. She dried her hands on the dish towel with sharp, jerky movements. I need to go lie down. This conversation is giving me a headache. As she started to leave the kitchen, I called after her. The locket, Margaret. I need it back. She paused in the doorway, her back still turned to me. I don't have your locket, Sarah. Perhaps you misplaced it. But I knew she was lying. The question was why. What could my grandmother's simple silver locket possibly mean to Margaret? And why was she so desperate to have it that she'd risk sneaking into my room in the middle of the night? That afternoon I found myself in the attic, searching through old photo albums and documents. If Margaret knew something about my grandmother's locket, maybe there was a connection I'd missed. My grandmother had died when I was 12, and I'd inherited very few of her belongings. The locket had been a surprise gift from my mother on my 18th birthday. She'd found it among Grandma Rose's things and thought I should have it. As I flipped through faded photographs, one image made me stop cold. It was a picture of my grandmother as a young woman, probably in her 20s, standing next to another girl who looked remarkably familiar. The second woman had the same elegant bone structure, the same intelligent eyes that I'd grown accustomed to seeing across the breakfast table. It was Margaret. Decades younger, but unmistakably Margaret. My hands shook as I turned the photograph over. In my grandmother's careful script were the words, Rose and Margaret, 1967. Best friends forever. I stared at the photograph until my eyes burned, trying to process what I was seeing. My grandmother Rose and Margaret had known each other, had been best friends, according to the inscription. But how was that possible? Margaret had never mentioned knowing my family before David and I met. In fact, she'd seemed genuinely surprised when I'd told her about my grandmother during one of our early conversations. The pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed began shifting in my mind. Margaret's reaction to the locket, her desperate search through my drawers, her insistence that some secrets should stay buried. Suddenly it all took on a different meaning. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to find them. My mother lived an hour away in the same small town where I'd grown up. If anyone would know about the connection between my grandmother and Margaret, it would be her. I grabbed my keys and drove there in a daze, the photograph clutched in my sweaty palm. Sarah. What a lovely surprise, Mom said as she opened the door. But her smile faded when she saw my expression. Honey, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Mom, I need to ask you about Grandma Rose. I held up the photograph. Did you know she and my mother-in-law were friends? The color drained from my mother's face. She stepped back, one hand pressed to her throat. Where did you find that? In the attic. Mom, what's going on? Margaret's been acting strange, and last night I caught her going through my things. She took Grandma's locket. My mother closed her eyes and leaned against the doorframe. Oh, Sarah. I was hoping this day would never come. What day? Mom, you're scaring me. She gestured for me to come inside, her movements slow and deliberate. We sat in her living room. The same room where I'd spent countless afternoons as a child, where everything had always felt safe and predictable. Today, even the familiar floral wallpaper seemed ominous. Your grandmother and Margaret were inseparable when they were young, my mother began, her voice barely above a whisper. They grew up together, went to school together, even dated boys from the same group. They were like sisters. But Margaret never said anything about knowing Grandma. Why would she keep that a secret? My mother's hands twisted in her lap. because of what happened in 1968. The year after that photograph was taken. I waited, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure my mother could hear it. They both fell in love with the same man, she continued. Your grandfather, actually. Before I came along. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. Grandpa? But I thought he and Grandma met at college. They did. But Margaret was there too. She was Rose's roommate. My mother's voice grew smaller with each word. Margaret was in love with him first, had been dating him for months. But when he met your grandmother. She shrugged helplessly. Sometimes these things just happen. He chose Rose. I tried to imagine my sweet, gentle grandmother as the other woman in a love triangle. It seemed impossible, but the pain in my mother's eyes told me it was true. Margaret was devastated, Mom continued. She felt betrayed by her best friend. The friendship ended and Margaret transferred to a different school. Your grandparents never saw her again. Until now, I whispered. Until you married her son. My mother looked at me with such sadness that I wanted to cry. Sarah, when you first told me your fiancé's last name, I wondered. But Margaret isn't an uncommon name, and I thought surely it couldn't be the same person. It wasn't until your wedding day when I saw her face. I remembered my wedding day, how my mother had seemed unusually quiet during the reception. How she kept staring at Margaret with an odd expression I couldn't interpret at the time. You knew it was her and you didn't tell me? What would have been the point? It was so long ago. I thought maybe we could all just move forward. But we hadn't moved forward. Margaret had been living with this secret for 3 years, watching me wear her former best friend's locket, probably reliving her heartbreak every time she saw it around my neck. The locket, I said suddenly. There's something special about it, isn't there? My mother nodded slowly. Your grandfather gave it to your grandmother when they got engaged. But originally. She took a shaky breath. Originally he'd bought it for Margaret. He was planning to propose to her. But then he met Rose and everything changed. The room felt like it was spinning. Margaret hadn't just taken a piece of jewelry. She'd taken back something that should have been hers in the first place. I drove home in a fog of conflicting emotions. Part of me felt sympathy for Margaret. She'd lost both her best friend and the love of her life in one devastating blow. But another part of me was angry that she'd kept this secret, had let me welcome her into my life while harboring such resentment. The house was quiet when I arrived. David wouldn't be home for hours and I could hear Margaret moving around upstairs. I climbed the steps slowly, each creak of the old wood announcing my approach. I found her in her bedroom, sitting at her vanity table with the locket open in her palm. She was staring at the tiny photograph inside. A picture of my grandparents on their wedding day that I'd placed there years ago. I know, I said from the doorway. She didn't look up, didn't seem surprised that I'd discovered the truth. Your mother told you. She told me about you and Grandma Rose. About my grandfather. Margaret's thumb traced the edge of the locket with infinite care. 57 years, she whispered. For 57 years, I've wondered what my life might have been like if he'd chosen me instead. I stepped into the room, moving carefully as if approaching a wounded animal. Margaret, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. How could you? Rose never spoke of me, I'm sure. People rarely talk about the friends they've betrayed. The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut. She didn't betray you. Love isn't something you can control. Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. Spoken like someone who's never had their heart ripped out by their best friend. I sat on the edge of her bed, close enough to see the tears she was trying so hard to hold back. Is that why you were so cold to me when David and I first started dating? Because I reminded you of her. You have her eyes, Margaret said softly. The same green eyes that used to look at me with such trust and affection. When David brought you home that first time, I thought I was seeing a ghost. The photograph of my grandparents seemed to mock us both from its place in the locket. Two young people in love, unaware of the decades of pain their happiness would cause. I tried to hate you, Margaret continued. It would have been so much easier to hate you. But you were so kind, so genuine. You reminded me not just of how Rose looked, but of who she used to be before. She trailed off, shaking her head. Before she fell in love with Grandpa. Before she chose him over our friendship. We'd made a pact, you see. We'd promised each other that we'd never let a man come between us. But when push came to shove, she chose love over loyalty. I thought about my own friendships. wondering if I would have made the same choice in Rose's position. It was easy to judge from a distance, but love had a way of making people do things they never thought they would. "The night you caught me in your room," Margaret said, "I'd been lying awake thinking about James, your grandfather. It was his birthday, you know. He would have been 86. I hadn't known. My mother had never made a big deal about my grandfather's birthday after he died. I kept thinking about the locket, about how it should have been mine. How different everything might have been if he'd never met Rose." She looked at me then, her eyes red with unshed tears. "I know it was wrong to take it, but I just needed to hold it one more time, to imagine what it would have felt like to receive it from him." "You can keep it," I heard myself say. Margaret's eyes widened. "Sarah, no. I can't. It belongs to you. It belonged to you first." I reached over and gently closed her fingers around the locket. "Grandpa bought it for you. Maybe it's time it came home." She stared at me in disbelief, tears finally spilling over onto her cheeks. "But it's all you have left of your grandmother." "No," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "I have something better. I have you." Margaret looked at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "You have me. Sarah, I don't understand. Don't you see? This whole time I've been mourning the fact that I never really got to know my grandmother. I was so young when she died, and I always felt like I'd missed out on having that special relationship that some people have with their grandparents." I took her weathered hands in mine. "But you knew her. You were her best friend. You can tell me things about her that no one else knows." Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. She sobbed like a woman who'd been holding back grief for decades, which I realized she had been. "She loved butterflies," Margaret whispered between tears. "She used to say they reminded her that beautiful things could come from the most unlikely beginnings. She kept a butterfly garden behind her dormitory, and she'd spend hours there reading poetry." I smiled through my own tears. I'd never known about the butterflies, but it explained why my mother had always planted butterfly bushes in our yard. She was terrible at math but brilliant at languages. She could speak French like she'd been born in Paris, and she was teaching herself Italian because she dreamed of traveling to Europe. Margaret's voice grew stronger as the memories flowed. "She wanted to be a teacher, you know. She wanted to inspire children to love learning the way she did." These weren't just random facts. They were pieces of my grandmother's soul that I'd never known existed. Through Margaret's memories, Rose was becoming real to me in a way she never had before. "Tell me more," I said. For the next hour, Margaret painted a picture of my grandmother that no photograph or family story had ever captured. She told me about Rose's infectious laugh, her terrible cooking, her habit of talking to herself when she was concentrating. She described the way Rose would scrunch up her nose when she was thinking hard about something, and how she could never remember where she'd put her keys. "She sounds wonderful," I said when Margaret finally paused. She was. Even after everything that happened between us, I never stopped loving her. She was my sister in every way that mattered. Something in Margaret's tone made me look at her more carefully. There was something else, something she wasn't telling me. "Margaret, what aren't you saying?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the locket in her hands. When she spoke, her voice was so soft I had to strain to hear her. "The day before your grandfather proposed to Rose, he came to see me. He told me he was going to end things between us, that he'd fallen in love with someone else. I was devastated, but I understood. You can't force someone to love you." I waited, sensing there was more. But before he left, he gave me something. A letter he'd written to Rose, explaining why he was choosing her over me. He asked me to deliver it to her, said he couldn't bear to see the look in her eyes when she realized what it would cost our friendship. My breath caught. "Did you give it to her?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "I threw it away. I was hurt and angry, and I thought if she never knew the full truth about what he'd said about our friendship, maybe she wouldn't feel as guilty. Maybe she could be happy without the burden of knowing exactly how much she'd hurt me." What did the letter say? That he'd chosen her not just because he loved her, but because he believed she was the better person. Kinder, more generous, more worthy of love. Margaret's voice broke on the last words. He was right, of course. Rose proved that by marrying him despite losing me. I would have made him choose between his love and his conscience. She made no such demands. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. All these years, my grandmother had probably blamed herself for the end of their friendship, never knowing that my grandfather had orchestrated the whole thing, and that Margaret had protected her from that knowledge. "Margaret," I whispered, "you gave up your chance at happiness to protect hers." "I gave up nothing," she said firmly. "If he could write those things about me, then he never loved me the way I thought he did." The letter just made it clear that Rose was always going to be his choice. As Margaret spoke, I realized something that made my heart race. All this time I'd been thinking about this as a story about lost love and broken friendship. But there was another layer, another truth that no one had seen. "Margaret," I said slowly, "how did you end up marrying David's father?" She looked puzzled by the change of subject. "I met Robert 2 years later at my new school." "Why do you ask? What was his last name before you married him?" "Collins, of course. The same as David's." But something wasn't adding up. A memory surfaced, something David had mentioned casually months ago about his family history. "Margaret, didn't David tell me once that his father was adopted?" The color drained from Margaret's face. "Sarah, what are you getting at?" My mind was racing now, putting together pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed. David's father was adopted. You married a man named Robert Collins. But Collins wasn't his birth name, was it? Margaret stood up abruptly, the locket clutching in her fist. "Sarah, you need to stop this line of questioning right now." But I couldn't stop. The truth was right there, hovering just beyond my grasp. "What was Robert's birth name, Margaret?" She closed her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Thompson. Robert Thompson." The world tilted on its axis. "Thompson. My grandmother's maiden name was Rose Thompson." "Oh my God," I whispered. "Robert was Rose's brother. David's father was my grandmother's brother." Margaret nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "Robert was the baby Rose's family gave up for adoption when she was 5 years old. She never stopped looking for him, never stopped hoping she'd find her little brother someday." The implications crashed over me like a tidal wave. David and I weren't just married. We were cousins. Margaret hadn't just lost her best friend and the love of her life. She'd ended up marrying into the very family that had destroyed her happiness, never knowing the connection until it was too late. "Does David know?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "No one knows except me. Robert died without ever learning the truth about his birth family." "And Rose?" Margaret's voice cracked. "Rose died never knowing that her beloved lost brother had been found, had had a son, had been living just 2 states away." "Margaret, we have to tell David. He deserves to know." "Do we?" Margaret asked, her eyes fierce with desperation. "Do we tell him that his marriage is built on a cosmic joke? That fate played such a cruel trick on all of us? What good would come from that truth?" I stared at her, understanding finally dawning. This was why she'd been so desperate to get the locket back. It wasn't just about lost love. It was about protecting a secret that could destroy the only family she had left. "You've been carrying this alone all these years," I said. "It's been my burden to bear. But now..." She looked at me with such pain that my heart broke for her. "Now I've dragged you into it too." In that moment, I realized that Margaret and I were bound together by something much deeper than marriage or family ties. We were both women who'd loved people we could never fully have, her with my grandfather, me with my grandmother's memory. And now we shared a secret that could change everything or destroy it all. As I sat there in Margaret's bedroom holding the locket that had started this whole journey, I understood that some truths were too big for one person to carry alone. But I also understood that some secrets were too dangerous to share. The question was, which kind of truth were we dealing with now? Outside, I heard David's car pulling into the driveway, and I knew our time for decisions was running out. Margaret looked at me with eyes that held 57 years of secrets, and I realized that whatever choice we made in the next few minutes would change all of our lives forever. The locket seemed to pulse with the weight of all the stories it had witnessed, all the hearts it had broken and healed. And as David's footsteps approached the front door, I finally understood what my grandmother's real legacy was. Not the jewelry or the photographs, but the complex web of love and loss that connected us all.